I'm going to be painting a blue lotus flower today. This is the one right here. You can see one that I've already completed previously, and I'm going to be showing you how I go about doing that. So first of all, my tools and materials, I have a size 2 brush. This is a size 1, a size 0, an older brush, which has a tip that's a little bit more worn. Possibly might use a white gel pen. Not sure if I'll need that. And of course I've got my watercolors and my palette. So first thing I start off doing is I'm going to wet the entire area that's going to be purple on this flower. So I just take clean water, my clean water over here, and I make sure that I don't go outside of the lines of where this flower is. And I just wet all the petal areas. And this is going to give space for the pigment to flow and move when I lay it, and I don't have to do the whole flower all at once. I can do a few petals and then go back and then do the rest of them. But what I do want to do is make sure that I don't stop my wet edges in the middle of a petal. I don't want to just wet half of this petal here. I want to get the whole thing if I'm going to do that, because if I only wet halfway, when I set the paint into it, it will only bleed as far as I have wet. Also, I want to be careful that I don't get too much into these little detail-y areas. I don't want water on those, because I also don't want the purple to bleed into there. Now once I have an area wet, and actually I should have done this first, is to mix my colors, because once your areas are wet, you have a time ticking for you until that dries. I'm going to use a little bit of quinacridone purple, which is this color, mixed with probably some rhodonite over here. This is that pinkish color, and cobalt blue. And this is a palette that I have put together myself of the colors that I find most useful for the color schemes that I typically use. I mix those colors, and I want it to be more bright purpley pinky, so I'm getting some more of that. Again, like I said, this would have been better off done before I started wetting the flower down, because now things are drying. But I did use a lot of excess water, so in this case it's okay, because I actually need to dab off some of it. All right, once I get my color mixed, then I just start putting it in as a wash. And you can see over here, this section, it's bleeding outwards. This is what I was talking about, why you lay down the water initially, because it just helps the paint spread out nice and evenly across all the zones where you want it to. And it stops short of the edges that you wet. So you see it doesn't go beyond any of those areas. Having a nicely pointed brush helps with getting in between in all these little tricky areas as well. This is why I like using Kolinsky sable brushes. And I splattered a little bit over there. Just going to wipe that up. And so I continue using this method of wetting the areas and then laying a very light wash of my base color onto the petals. You can see this is not a very rich or deep tone yet, because this is the color that I want for the highlights of my flower to have. this is what's going to be showing through as the brightest points on the petals. Speeding things up now just to get through this section, but I'm essentially doing the same technique, wetting it down and laying down a wash. Once those initial washes are dry, then I can go back in and start layering other washes and glazes on top to create the shadows and textures that I want to do. So I'm going to start with mixtures of basically those same 3 colors that I showed you before, and it's just going to be varying quantities of those 3 colors as I progress from here on in now. Sometimes there'll be more of the pink, sometimes more of the blue, so that you get this nice variation all around the whole flower. Some of it's going to depend on where the locations of the shadows are. For example, over here, these petals are behind, and so those I'm using more of the blues. You can see the shadows, I use more of the blues, whereas for the areas that are more to the front, where the light is hitting from, these parts I'm using more of the pink tones and actually just letting a lot of the initial glaze, this purplish pink glaze, show through. In this flower now you can see I've used more of a pinkish tone as my base over here and a little bit more of the bluish purple tones on this side of the flower, this half of it, for the lighting. Now I'm going to start mixing up some more. What I like to do sometimes is I mix up variations ahead of time in my palette so I have them all here and I don't have to keep worrying about mixing as I go. So here I have a more neutral purple tone, there's a pink one, let's do one that has more of the blue cobalt in it. And I might even mix a little bit of Prussian blue, which is this blue here. I really like mixing that with purples for some rich tones, but you have to be careful not to use too much of it because it can become very overpowering quickly. All right, so now I have my 3 purple versions ready to go, and at this point I can just use what I have on the palette. I don't have to go very often back to my colors any longer, maybe for a little bit of variation here and there. And I'm going to start with the size 0 brush and adding a glaze of color to some of these back petals and getting them a little bit darker. I'm still avoiding painting over the filaments from the center of the flower because those are going to be a bright yellow and orange color, and I don't want to muddy those up with too much of the purple tones because of course if you mix purple with yellow you're just going to get this ugly brown color and that's not going to do anyone any good. And I mix up my techniques. Sometimes I'm using glazes, sometimes I'm using dry brush, sometimes I'm just sort of pulling the wet paint down towards the center of the flower. And you'll notice that in these petals as I go, I'm starting from the tips of them and I'm pulling down and inward towards the center of the flower. I'm not going at crosswise. I'm not doing any sort of other brush strokes that would be distracting to the texture of the actual item that I'm painting and the way that the light hits it. Because if I were to go at angles, you know, like this, cross squiggling wherever, these would turn into distracting brush strokes. Meanwhile, by doing it this way, where I'm kind of pulling down from the tip, I get the darkest paint, I get the darkest tones and colors at the tip of the flower, which is what I want, because the center of these blue lotuses is usually kind of white and glowing and less saturated in tone. So I want to keep the most saturated areas outward towards the edges, and starting my brush strokes up from there helps to do that, helps to accomplish it. And you can see I'm using a dry brush technique as well to really get that sort of feathered, crinkled look that flower petals often have. I go back and forth also sometimes between painting with dry brush and then brushing over the whole area that I just painted with clear water. It doesn't look very clear any longer. It looks pretty purple, but it's still clean. And that just serves to blend out some of the rougher little bits of texture. And just go all the way around the flower in this fashion, from one petal to the next. This one is a little bit further back, so I'm giving it a bit more of a darker punch of color. But you'll notice that when I bring the dark areas up against other petals, I make sure that whatever I'm painting up against too is dry so that the color doesn't bleed out into there and you lose that definition. Unless I want to. I mean, this is a subject I'll go into some other time, but edge control, where sometimes you want colors to bleed into the other. For example, in the backgrounds, and as well, sometimes I'm going to want the stems to sort of blend out. I haven't painted those areas yet. But in those cases, I'm going to want to work in up against areas that are wet. In this case, where I am working on something that is very sharply in focus, then I don't want any of those edges to be blending into each other, and I want to be able to control that. Now this petal, I went counter to what I was telling you earlier. I actually started from the center and I'm moving the paint out, because in this one I want sort of a darker zone down in close here as it is overlaid by other petals. And so this is the process that I just basically repeat all the way around the flower, getting all the petals in this way. Mixture of washes, dry brush, and then hitting it with clear water just to blend and smooth things out, and continuing to layer that, then repeating on top even after I've smoothed out areas, because it's this buildup of layers that really gives you a lot of interest, a lot of textural interest. I'm getting a little bit more cobalt blue now because I want the outer parts of these lower petals here to have much more of a bluish tone to them. And I'm going to just do that as a wash. And by hitting these with a base wash like this, that means I'm eliminating the opportunity of having any super bright highlights on these petals, but I'm not going to want that, so that's all good. You see that mostly I'm working with my size 0 brush too. I tend to do that for a large part of my paintings, which might be why they take so long to paint, because when you're painting 20 by, this is 20 by 16 inch painting with a tiny little brush like this, it can take a while. You see I'm blending my wash outwards again in towards the center of my flower, because as I mentioned earlier, I want the center to be brighter, but in this case not super bright. That's why I'm adding this wash. Capturing this really electric blue color that you find in flowers very frequently, surprisingly frequently, is extremely hard. Even when they look really bright in a painting, you hold up the actual flower next to it and you find that it dulls by comparison. There's just some colors in nature that are incredibly hard to replicate in paint. I just ordered another 4 different Daniel Smith colors online this morning, which I'm excited to receive, hopefully in a few days. And then maybe it'll even come in time for me to use it on this painting. It always happens to me. I realize I don't have a color that I need, and I go and order it. But by the time I order it, I'm usually halfway through a painting, and then it arrives, and I no longer need it for that particular painting. But I'll have it for the future, so that's all good. The last time that happened was when I was working on the monarch butterflies for that giant poster I did for Pollinator Partnership. I don't know if you saw it. If you didn't, then you can find it on my social media or on my website. If you're seeing this on my Patreon, I'll post a link to that too, just so you can see what I'm talking about and babbling about here. But I was painting about, I believe it was 80 butterflies in that piece. That's a lot of butterflies. And after hours of doing it, tens of hours of doing it, painting these monarch butterflies, and constantly having to mix my proper amount of gamboge yellow and what was it that I was using? I was using some of these quinacridone reds, which I love, by the way. They are this beautiful, rich, bright red tone, but trying to capture the exact shade, that really bright shade of orange that monarch butterfly wings have, was extremely frustrating. And if you overmix just a little bit of one color or the other, then it doesn't have that glow to it any longer. And with the wrong mixture of colors, then you lose it and you don't get that effect anymore. So it's a tricky thing to find the balance for and to really establish. All right. Over here you see I'm leaving this thin edge of paper because I don't want these two to bleed into each other. I want to maintain this edge along that petal. A little bit of a highlight. All right, looks like I've made my way around. A couple other little petals on this side I want to get. Again, I'm leaving a little thin edge along the bottom of this petal here because it's adjacent to one that I've just painted and it's still wet. All right. You can see that it's starting to gain the shape, the cupped shape of the flower. Now again, I'm going to let all of this glazed stuff dry before I continue with more layers of essentially dry brushing and smoothing out as I was showing you with these initial few petals here. I'm going to do that with the rest of these as well. Sped up here once again, just continuing around, doing the same technique that I just described on all the other petals to really pull out those highlights and shadows in them. Switching gears now, moving on to the filaments in the center of the flower. First thing I do when I'm going to be switching colors drastically is I refill my water. I get clean water because I don't want my purple tones to be muddying what is going to be bright yellow and red, like this flower here. So that's step one. Next part is to determine the colors I'm going to use. For this part, my base coat is going to be gamboge, which is this color over here on my palette. Gamboge is a great color for mixing and brightening reds and oranges, as well as just on its own as a really great transparent yellow, as opposed to something like lemon yellow or cadmiums, which are not as transparent and so don't really layer as well and give you this nice glow that you can achieve with a transparent bright yellow. So I get that onto my palette, and as I did before with the purple, I'm just laying in a basic wash. Now this time I'm not really bothering to wet down my area before doing this wash because in this instance it is not as critical for me to have a smooth gradation since it's just a small area, and as well there are lots of fine little details in these guys. So it's not really necessary to pre-wet the page before applying it. I'm going to switch over to my finer brush, my size 1 brush, size 0 brush now. And it's very critical that you have a clean brush when you are starting off with colors as bright and light as this, because any sort of muddiness or dirtying with other colors is going to become very apparent. Now you notice that I'm not actually going all the way to the tips of these filaments because those in a blue lotus are actually purple color. You can see on this guy again. It's nice to have an example of a finished one right in front of us, isn't it? So once I get this base coat of yellow, and it's not super bright, this is only to achieve a baseline for highlights. That's the sole purpose of doing this initial layer that you see me do, both with the purple earlier and now with the yellow. It's to have a baseline for my highlights, and from there I build up my darks and push back the shadows and really intensify the colors. Now the tip of these filaments is actually this pinkish maroon tone, and for that I'm going to take a mixture of, let's see, quinacridone coral, which is this color over here, and maybe a touch of the purple that I was using, which is a quinacridone purple, or maybe some purpurite, which is a very Daniel Smith specific color. All right, so here's my quinacridone pink. Sorry, quinacridone coral. That's what I said. And a little bit of that quin purple. See, that dulls the color a little bit. That's what I want. I don't want to dull it completely though. I still want to maintain that really bright, fresh look to it. And this is purpurite. which has a little bit more of a warm, earthy brown tone. Again, not too much of that because I want to maintain the brightness. All right, a little bit more of the purpurite. I think that gives me the color mixture that I'd like. And I'm going to use this now with my size 0 brush and very carefully start, make sure this is dry first. All right, because I'm doing detail now, so if my wash isn't dry, then that would kind of foil my detail plans and it would just all start to bleed out everywhere, which is not what we want at this stage in the game. What I want is to be able to have fine control over my detailed bits. Let's see, let's zoom in a little bit closer. So that you guys can better see what I'm doing here. Now, what I'm doing is I'm painting around the foregroundmost filaments. This is at the same time shadow as well as coloration, because on this plant, the tips of the filaments are this maroonish, pinky purple color. But it also serves to help pop out the foreground filaments. I'm working on the ones that are further back first, the ones that are more towards the inner part of this clustered clump, and then working my way to the outer ones. And at this point, I'm mostly applying the paint via dry brush technique. If you haven't seen my previous videos about that, you should check it out on my YouTube, because I discuss more in depth about how exactly dry brushing works. And the other thing I'm trying to maintain here is the spherical shape of this cluster of filaments, because essentially this is a tightly curled up and coiled ball that is at the center of the flower, and that's something that the shape of it is something that you need to maintain in your mind the entire time as you paint it. So in addition to the coloration elements, the way the shadows and light hit this object essentially are going to have to be at the forefront of your mind at all times, so that as you paint, you can remember to shape it in that way. It gets difficult when you're dealing with not only shadow and light, but also coloration, because we have the light coming in from above. So without coloration, this top part would usually be the brightest part of the piece, of this object, this ball of clustered filaments. But in this case, because they are also affected by the color, you have these two elements at war with each other, and you have to be really careful as you paint it and as you apply tone and color to maintain that balance between shape and pattern. Sometimes you can do that by first dealing only with one element at a time, dealing in this case with, just the coloration and pattern, and then afterwards kind of pulling out the shape more with successive washes of color foreshadowing that sort of emphasize the shape more. All right, so now I'm going to start to move out on the more extended little filament tips. Those guys also have this pinkish little maroon blush to them. And at this point, I'm definitely mostly using a dry brush type of stroke in order to achieve this. I'd also like to point out that something I mentioned earlier when I was painting the petals was that I always make my brush strokes go in the direction of the textures, and you'll see that is exactly what I'm continuing to do on these filaments. You don't see me going horizontally with these strokes. Instead, I am brushing along the length of them. Now, when I do some shadowed bits, sometimes I will go horizontally, but I will keep in mind then the curvature. Even when you're talking about something this small, there's going to be curvature because each of these is a three-dimensional object, right? Each of these is essentially sort of a weird flattened ovoid sort of cylinder shape. And as such, they're going to have highlights and shadows as well. And I keep that in mind, actually, as I paint these little maroon bits to them, because I'll leave lighter highlight areas along the edges, and I'll darken along one side. So I just make my way around to every one of these little filaments, and they all get this treatment. I'm going to add a little bit of brightness to this. I'm going to add some quinacridone orange. That might be a little bit too bright. Dull it down again with some purple. You notice I'm using actually a lot of quinacridrones. They are one of my favorites for the red, orange, purple range of tones. They have excellent light fastness, and they are also extremely brilliant and bright in their tones. So they make achieving those perfect cherry reds achievable. It's something that I struggled with for a long time in my watercolor pigment selection, trying to find just the right pigment that would give me that rich red that I was looking for. And when I found the quinacridrones, that was when my search came to an end. Mine in particular are Daniel Smith brand. I believe you can find them with other brands as well. They are synthetic and non-toxic, and they are great. And they come in a whole range of tones that cover the range of colors between sort of orangey reds to deep reds and even into purples. All right, I'm going to use a little bit more, mixing some more. Actually, I'm going to use that quinacridone orange. Actually, I think it's called quinacridone sienna. That's this one right here. Quin yellow is another favorite of mine, and I might use it here. Actually, I think that is even better suited. Let's get some of that quinacridone yellow. Oh yeah, there we go. It's the beautiful sort of egg yolk yellow. And now I'm going to glaze that on top of these. You see I'm still leaving some of the foreground filaments with that base gamboge yellow that I painted on initially. This is what I was talking about, how that becomes my baseline for highlights. And you see also, as I'm coming to the top, I'm also leaving highlighted areas of yellow. This is, as I was mentioning earlier, that balance between the contours and shadow tones that are created versus the colors that are established via pattern and coloration. And I'm just sort of brushing over a lot of this stuff to really blend out that color into the lower areas. I'm also going to use it on these extended filaments around the outskirts. Still moving along lengthwise of each filament. Not only is this for the brushstroke element, but it's also just for ease of the shape, right? It's a waste of your gestures and movements to be trying to fight the shape of your object and moving horizontally when it's a vertical thing. All right, that gives me a beautiful bright bit all along the base of it. Now I'm going to further work on the upper crown area here, as well as the tips of all these filaments, because those parts, as I mentioned, have a little bit of purple to it. I'm going to go back to my earlier purple colors that I had mixed, which are still here in my palette. A little dry. All I need to do is add water. This is the wonderful part of watercolor. Never waste any of your pigment, because you just add water and you can continue using it. So each of these little guys is purple on the tip. And I'm leaving a little bit of highlight on the very tip. That's just white paper. Or I guess it's the gamboge base that you're seeing. As I mentioned earlier, again, it's the baseline highlight. This is dry brush. I'm just going to work my way around to every single one of these little guys and do this same bit of purple and highlight. Sped up here once again. Nearly done with this flower now. Most of the base tones are in place, all the shadows, all the coloration. All that's left here are some really fine points of deep shadow and highlight and reflected light. And these are going to be the things that really make it start to pop and bring it out from a more flat depiction into something that is a part of its surroundings and part of everything else that is happening and the colors that are going on in this picture. So in this case, what I'm going to start to do is to add some washes of other colors. And because I have these blue-greens that are a part of the rest of this painting, I'm going to need some of those to really tie this flower into the surroundings. To do that, I'm going to grab some Sleeping Beauty blue, as well as some ultramarine turquoise, which are this color, that's the Sleeping Beauty, and this is the ultramarine turquoise. Those are the two tones that I'm basically going to be adding into this. And I'm only going to need light washes of this. I'm not going to need a whole lot in spot areas. Some of these petals here are going to get a little bit of glaze of that Sleeping Beauty blue. Like that. And a glaze, just to remind you guys, it's just a very light layer, pretty diluted. You can see I'm adding a lot of water into this. And it's just going to be the barest hint of color in some of these areas. It's not really anything that's going to overpower the tones and the shadows that I have already established. It's more to put context for all of these. And by context, I'm talking about the background. Actually, in these inner areas, I'm going to add a little bit of a reflected yellow-orange glow. Going to go back to that quinacridone yellow that I made earlier, and going to use that just in the inner parts of the petals. Just a little bit of a reflected element. Now again, this gives context to everything. It makes the central filament a part of the whole flower. It's not just sitting there, but it is a part of the whole. Add a little bit up here as well. These are also going to be seeing some reflected element because of the white tones and nature of those petals. Now this just makes the whole thing sort of start to glow because you start getting the center of the flower really permeating, the colors permeating the rest. Okay, and then I'm going to take actually a surprising little bit of a more reddish tone. Let's see, I'm going to take, I think I'm going to use this garnet color. Just very little bit of it. Grab that. Doesn't need to be the pure tone, so I'm just going to reuse one of these wells that I had some of the colors in before. And because this is such a contrast to the colors that I have already, it really serves to emphasize the shadows. Now this one I'm not doing as a wash, I'm actually doing it as dry brush, just in some of the deep shadow areas. A little bit of red adds a lot of punch. And it makes the flower as a whole just more complex in the tones and shades that are a part of it. Makes it that much more rich. Still maintaining that brush stroke that goes with the texture of the flower. Always keep that in mind whenever you're painting anything with texture, that your brush strokes are going to be visible. They're going to be a part of what you create. And so you have to be aware of that, and you have to make them integrated into whatever you are painting. They are not an obstacle to overcome, but a necessary part of its creation. And finally, I'm going to add a little bit of green, which would be surprising. You wouldn't think that Oh wait, actually a little bit more of that garnet. I want to add some deeper sharp shadows into the center area. Just a little touch. I'm going to use something darker. Actually, I'm going to go for Van Dyke Brown. Van Dyke Brown is this guy over here. And it's a nice, deep, rich brown. And that is just going to be used very sparingly in a few little cracks and areas. That really helps to anchor everything. And give it a solidity and form. Not too much. I don't want to be outlining things with this. I really want to have it just as a little bit of emphasis. And actually I'm going to switch to a little bit of green for that. Going to use, let's see, this serpentine green, mixing with a little bit of that ultramarine turquoise that I had before. So that gives me this dark green. And dry brushing, you'll notice that I'm actually going not with the texture of the petal, I'm going around in a crosswise but still curved dry brushing pattern. These are just kind of the deepest shadows. A little bit to pull it all together. Yeah, see, I like that a lot better than the neutral gray brown tones I was doing this with at first, because sometimes actually using a complementary color makes the darks look that much more rich. When you use a neutral tone like brown or gray, it just washes things out, and I prefer actually to go for the complementary push instead. And that gets you a really nice dark, but vibrant dark tone. All right, there we go. You can see the two blue lotuses that I have so far. They're called blue, but they're actually more of a purpley blue tone. And you can see the rest of the painting. I've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 more of them to do, plus that fantastic scarab. This is going to be a fun piece to finish up. And there's this lotus that I just showed you how I painted. All right, hopefully I will have a finished painting to share with you guys sometime soon.